You're absolutely right. I shouldn't punish those who are on time in favor of those who are late.
Absolutely.
So, friends, today is a very somber day. Today is Yom HaShoah. It started yesterday evening in Israel. Cinemas, coffee places were closed. There were national ceremonies. Today, in Poland, in Auschwitz, there was the March of the Living with the President of Israel and the head of the Mossad and many security officials from Israel. Okay? And I want to talk a little bit about the Holocaust from a Jewish historical perspective. And also theological, meaning spiritual perspective.
Question. I just happened to, I thought we might not have class today. And I Googled, Memorial Day for the Holocaust.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Yeah?
And do you know that there is an International Holocaust Day in January?
Yeah, and that International Memorial Day is based on the day of the liberation of Auschwitz by the Russians, which was, of course, the largest camp in which 1.5 million people were murdered, 1 million of whom were Jews. The others were gypsies, gay people, political prisoners, Russian POWs, Polish resistance members, other resistance members. So there are 2 dates. That's the date that we commemorate as a people. The date in January has been adopted by many countries in Europe, including the United Kingdom. In the very religious world, in the very observant world, in the ultra-Orthodox world, they condense the Holocaust within the context of Tisha B'Av, in which we lament all Jewish catastrophes throughout our history. There is a book that was authored by one of my teachers in rabbinical school, Professor Alan Mintz of blessed memory, where he basically collected Jewish literature dealing with catastrophes. So one of the first pieces of Jewish literature that we have dealing with a national catastrophe was the scroll of lamentation in the Bible, the book of lamentation, Megillat Eicha, which we read on Tisha B'Av night. And it's a very interesting text. If you read it, we think that it was written by a scribe that wrote for Jeremiah. Jeremiah lived during the time of the destruction of the first temple, some 27 centuries ago, and he had a scribe, he had a guy who wrote for him. Just like, to distinguish, JFK had a speechwriter called Ted Sorensen, who was Jewish, by the way. Sorensen, his father was Danish, his mother was Jewish. So the guy who wrote, "Ask not what your country can do for you," was Jewish, by the way. So if you read Megillat Eicha, a book of Scroll of Lamentations on Tisha B'Av or any other day, you see that part of it has a rebuke towards God in the early chapters. Right? You slaughtered, you had no compassion for your people. Then, in the 2nd century, after Rome destroyed the first temple in the 1st century, in the year 70, in the 2nd century, the Jews were exiled. In the year 135, we were expelled from Israel, exiled. The 2 millennia old exile starts around that time, the year 135. And you see these great rabbis.
Destruction of the second temple?
Destruction of the first temple, the year 70 of the Common Era. The second is in the year 70. Okay. The first in minus 587. Good?
Minus 587.
Mm-hmm.
Before Christ.
Correct.
That sounds like
we say BCE, before Common Era.
Around the time the Persians.
Sorry?
Jews were captive of the Persians at around 580.
They were what?
Captive of the Persians.
Of the Babylonians.
Yeah. Okay.
And then, so the temple was destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era, but Jews were still allowed to live in Israel until they tried to revolt again against the Roman Empire in the years 132 to 135. This is known as the Bar Kokhba revolt, which failed. And then Jews were expelled from Israel. At that time, you also have great rabbis, like Rabbi Ishmael, for example, writing and very rebuking things towards heaven, like where was God and so forth. So just to show us that there have been many catastrophes for thousands of years in which Jewish authors, writers, rabbis, scholars, theologians had a moment of spiritual crisis and even spiritual polemic, argument with God,
Can't believe it.
so to speak.
He is early?
So,
What happened? Are you okay?
welcome, Mrs. Ben Simon.
Thank you.
Shalom Vacha.
Shalom.
So, for example, Rabbi Ishmael of antiquity, before we say the Amidah, we say, Mi chamocha ba'elim, Hashem. Who is like you amongst the gods, O Hashem? Meaning all the other gods are false gods. They're just ephemeral things. What are other gods today? Money, the state, we all know that. The self today with the selfie and Facebook. So instead of saying, Mi chamocha ba'elim, who is like you amongst the gods, one of the greatest rabbis of that time, the 2nd century, the failed revolt against Rome, they say, Mi kamocha ba'ilmim, who is like you amongst the mute, meaning God doesn't speak, God doesn't intervene. Okay? So we already see the first 2 episodes in which Jewish intellectuals, spiritual leaders, rabbis, scholars rebuke God's, what they perceive as God's passivity when Israel is being slaughtered by its enemy. The scroll of Eicha, Lamentation, we read on Tisha B'Av, has critiques against God in the first person. You slaughtered us, you had no compassion for us. Then, in the 2nd century, we see these critiques of some of the rabbis during the failed Bar Kokhba revolt. Then, fast forward almost 1,000 years to the Crusades. The year is 1096. The Christian knights are traveling from Europe, from Western Europe, to the land of Israel to take over Israel from the hands of the Muslims. And en route to Israel, they massacre entire Jewish communities. And many of them commit suicide rather than be forcibly converted. And even their children. And others were burnt alive. I'm reading now the memoirs of Shimon Peres of blessed memory, which were published posthumously after he passed away. Less than 2 years ago he passed away. And he tells the story of how his maternal grandfather was a great rabbi in Poland, in the small town he grew up in before the war. And he used to hide in his grandfather's talit as a young boy in synagogue. And when the Germans came to the city, they took everyone into the synagogue, locked them in, and burned the synagogue. And there were a couple of survivors who said that his grandfather took the same talit and covered himself and started praying. So in the time of the Crusades, also, people were burned. So you have a literature that we have from more than from 1,000 years ago.
Where does Masada fit in?
I'll get to it in a sec.
Sorry.
No problem. So we have literature from the Crusades that also criticizes what they see as God's passivity, right? They say, in the binding of Isaac in the Bible, in the Torah, Akedat Yitzchak, Isaac was saved, spared at the last moment by the angel of God, right? But here, so many Jewish kids were not spared from the Crusades. So just to explain, those who just came in, Leah, Mark, Raquel, we're talking, today's Holocaust Day. So in that context, we're talking about questions of Jewish struggling with God in light, or rather in darkness, of great Jewish catastrophes. And we see that it's not something which occurred for the first time post-1945, post-Holocaust. We have such literature that we read on Tisha B'Av, the scroll of Lamentations, that rebukes God for his passivity or even lack of compassion. We have rabbis during the time of the failed revolt against Rome in the 2nd century, in the years 132 to 135, instead of singing Mi chamocha ba'elim, Adonai, who is amongst you in the gods, they say Mi chamocha ba'ilmim, who is amongst you in the mute. God is being silent while his people are being slaughtered. And now we said in the times of the Crusades too, we have this literature talking about the fact that this time, unlike in the binding of Isaac, God is not saving his children, right? So we see that it's an old theme. The theme is theodicy. Welcome. Hi.
Sorry I'm late.
Hi. Would you introduce yourself? Welcome.
My name is Mickey Sussman,
Hi, welcome.
and I live in the Palisades, and I think I was the first wedding here in 1980 in the chapel.
Wow, welcome. So glad you joined us today. How did you hear of the class? Just curious.
A friend of mine came to services
Uh-huh.
a couple of Saturdays.
Who's that?
Danielle Avidan
Uh-huh.
mentioned you.
Oh, very
And
nice.
she gave me the brochure, and I said,
Oh, wonderful.
Torah study.
So,
I've been studying
your
for
name
about
again? I'm
7
sorry?
years. What?
Your name again? Mickey?
Mickey
Uh-huh. Sussman, you said? Your last name again?
Zusman.
Zussman.
Z.
Close to mine.
I
Yeah.
know.
All right. So just welcome, Mickey. Eli is to your right, and facing you is Leah, Mark, Ralph, and Raquel, and I'm Tal. And since it's Holocaust Day today, we're talking about the fact that after the Holocaust was far from the first time in our history in which we had Jewish thinkers, writers, rabbis, philosophers dealing with God's passivity. Are you looking for a piece of paper or something?
Something to drink.
Oh, please. There's water here, there's coffee. So, we said after the destruction of the first temple, the scroll of Lamentations criticizes God. After the failed revolt against Rome, and during the Crusades. Now, forget about that. Even in the Bible itself, King David asks in the book of Psalms, in Tehillim, the following question. Ad matai reshaim ya'alozu. Until when will the wicked rejoice? Until when will you wake up to read in the LA Times that a Nazi war criminal just died in South America in hiding under a false name at the age of 102, living in serenity with his great-grandchildren? Until when will the wicked rejoice? This is not a new contention, a new issue in Judaism. Abraham already says to the Almighty, will the judge of the entire earth not act justly? Are innocent people really going to perish in Sodom and Gomorrah? Jeremiah asks in his book, why is it that parents eat unripe fruit and their children's teeth decay? In other words, why do sometimes one generation has to pay for the failures of the previous generation? So just to let us know this whole phenomena of spiritual literature which grapples with where was God in times of great disaster, tragedy, genocide. This question is called the question of theodicy. It's spelled theodicy. It's spelled Theodicy. Theodicy, I'll say it again, Theodicy. Theodicy is the question of how do we reconcile the Jewish view that the creator of the world is not what Aristotle called an unmoved mover, some prime force which formed the physical universe but is no longer invested in the universe. The Jewish view, the Jewish spiritual outlook is that the God of Israel, the God of the universe, is an active force in the world for good and for justice, for each and every one of us individually, for the people of Israel collectively, and for all of humankind. Right? So if this is so, how do we reconcile that with radical evil, with genocide, with great calamities and historical tragedies? So we see that this is a very old Jewish theme. It's not novel to the Holocaust in this respect. In fact, there are some historians who call the time in which the Romans exiled us in the year 135 of the Common Era, they call it the time of the Roman Holocaust, because hundreds of thousands of Jews were exiled and killed and enslaved. Now I owe you an answer to your question, Ralph. You asked about Masada, so I'll answer your first question.
I have another question.
So what happened is this. In the year 66 of the Common Era, the Jews of Israel tried to revolt against the Roman Empire. It took the Romans 4 years to defeat the revolt. In the year 70, they crushed it and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. However, there were still pockets of Jewish resistance. One of them was Masada. In Masada, you had a group of Jewish radical zealots who stayed there, and they would not surrender, even, not that they knew that the temple had fallen because they didn't have iPhones, but maybe the Romans let them know somehow. But Masada was in the year 73, 3 years after the destruction of the Second Temple. And as we know, it was a mass suicide because they didn't want their women and their children sold into slavery and prostitution, which was the Roman custom, if you like, at the time. These were their war conventions. So that's the answer to one of your questions. You have another question, sir?
I do, sir. You know what would be interesting for you to do for us, for the community, is like chronologically set these important dates.
Okay.
I think it's useful because we hear about events and so. Yeah. And we really don't know what happened first, what happened after, when. Was it at the first temple? Like sure. My question. Yeah. I think it would be very nice for us to have if you
very good.
I mean, suggestion.
First time in your life.
That I have a good suggestion.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much.
I can give you. I can give you. I can give you a few main dates now, in like a couple of minutes. You want to do that?
Yeah, but frankly, I think that the whole community would enjoy it, not just us.
I have done it a few times on Tisha B'Av. I would teach between the chapters in which, when we read Lamentations, the exile of the 10 tribes, the year minus 722. The destruction of the first temple, the year...
You can't go that fast now.
I read something interesting, and I don't know if it's true, but how did the Romans get up to Masada? There was no elevator.
Yeah.
That they captured a few Jewish men. I don't know how they did that. If they were up there to begin with, maybe they were on the ground. And then it was these Jewish men that figured out how to make I don't know if it was a ladder or a pulley or whatever it was, to get the Romans up to Masada.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a whole endeavor.
That's true?
Yeah, it was a whole endeavor. It took them a long time.
But where did they find these Jewish men? They couldn't have gotten them
if
they were up on Masada because they didn't have a way to get there. So they must have been on the ground. They captured them. Yeah,
they used whatever technology they have there, artillery of rocks. Whatever they had then. That's why it took them a very long time. And of course.
What you just said about where was God during the Holocaust? You never hear where was God during when the Jews were taken in Egypt. You never hear anyone. I never hear anyone mentioning that.
So.
Why is it always the Holocaust? I guess because it's more recent, and we know for sure it happened. A lot of people don't think.
Well, there's a lot to be said about that. There's a lot to be said about that. So we'll go into the Holocaust in a couple of minutes.
There was never anything worse than the Holocaust.
Yeah, that's true.
1/3 of the Jewish population.
That's true. But that's completely true. Full stop. And also, in the 2nd century, when the Romans exiled the Jewish people from Israel, hundreds of thousands of Jews were murdered, killed, exiled, enslaved, sold to prostitution in the Roman Empire. So, 2,000 years ago, at that time in the 2nd century, people didn't know that 2,000 years later, almost in the 20th century, something even worse is going to happen. So as far as they were concerned, that was the worst. But sure, the Holocaust is unprecedented. And I started giving us a few dates, right?
You did.
So minus 722 is the exile of the 10 tribes, the 10 vanished tribes, right? We found maybe the Ethiopians, and every now and then we come across other tribes.
Do you know, why the Mormons think they're the lost tribe?
No,
Have you ever had anything written about a lost tribe?
I don't think
they do, because I have Mormon friends that always tell me that.
I don't think, respectfully, that it's historically substantiated, but I don't know why they make that claim.
But Rabbi,
yes.
I would love to have. It's not going to be a complete list, but maybe
highlights,
and that here and there something else will come to mind and can be put to have some kind of chronological. I'm always confused what can come first.
So you like my suggestion?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just going to give you a handful
because
today. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. I've done it a few times, but I would be happy to do it again.
In a class? Or
in a
written form.
In a class, but I gave out handouts.
Okay.
But not in our setting. So minus 587 is the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians.
Did they kill any people when they came in here and did that?
Yeah, they sure did. The year 70 of the Common Era is the destruction of the Second Temple.
May I take one of these?
To write on, or?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Sure. So.
And that was by the destruction of the Second Temple?
By the Romans. Roman Empire. Then I'm going to skip a lot. In the year 1096, the beginning of the Crusades. Right? The Christian knights traveling to Israel, slaughtering much of European Jewry en route to Israel. So I'm giving you dates of calamities, of catastrophes. And then, of course, we have 1492, the expulsion from Spain.
And they never teach us in school.
Then, well, there's so much to teach. 1648 is known as the Chmielnicki massacres.
How do you spell that?
Chmielnicki
How do you spell that?
was, I'll tell you exactly. Chmielnicki was a Ukrainian general, and they massacred hundreds of thousands of Jews from massacres.
Where did that take place?
Ukraine.
Ukraine?
Yeah. So, Chmielnicki, let me spell his name for you. C-H-M...
Sorry, could you start again, please?
C-H-M like Max, I like Ira, E like Eric, L like Larry, N like Nancy, I like Ira, C like Kathy,
Oh boy.
K like Kevin, I like Israel. Chmielnicki.
I never heard
So,
that.
and then, of course, there were the pogroms in Russia, and there were... I'm skipping a lot of things. In the time of Maimonides, you had Islamic radicals that threaten Jewish communities. Unless they convert, they will be they will be executed as well.
Were the Moranos just in Spain?
Yes,
In
and
Portugal.
right, the Iberian Peninsula, and of course the Holocaust, right, 1933 to 1945. So I have here a few.
1933.
1933 is Hitler's rise to power, and then the legislation against the Jews and relegating them out of society. 38, November 38, and the actual murder is 39 to 45. So, the Nazis were in power for 12 years, and the first 6 years they dehumanization of the Jews through prejudicial legislation and incitement and propaganda, and the next 6 years was the actual genocide in practice.
I didn't think it started that early against the Jews.
Now, I have...
the expulsion from Egypt, or...
I think especially 56 after the Sinai War, right? You're talking about in the 20th century?
No.
No, she means the original.
When
The Exodus.
The Exodus from Egypt.
Well, according to some, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was Ramses II. So, we'd have to look.
Given a year?
Yeah, we would have to look exactly when did Ramses II reign, which I don't know by heart, but we can all Google at our leisure. I want to share with you a couple of things. One is a book that Elie Wiesel wrote that is not so familiar. Elie Wiesel's most famous book is called Night. It was in the Oprah book club, and she went with him to the camps.
I think it was famous before Oprah.
Yeah, but when she brought it to her club, it became #1 seller in America for quite a while. And he wrote another book that there is his memoirs, which is a 2-volume work. The first volume is called All Rivers Run to the Sea, and the second volume is And the Sea is Not Fulfilled. It's a verse in the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, that we read on Sukkot. And in the first volume, Wiesel describes his life in a small Hasidic town on the Romanian-Hungarian border before the Holocaust and his time in the Holocaust, and in an orphanage after the Holocaust. And the second volume is really about his life as a journalist and then a writer, and when he comes to America and becomes a great humanitarian. So Elie Wiesel wrote, by the way, another book called, he wrote, I think, more than 30 books. He has a book called The Accident, which I think it's interesting to note that I think it was maybe 1947. In the late 40s, Wiesel came to New York, and he was hit by a yellow cab around Times Square, and he almost died. You know, the doctors at the beginning didn't think he will make it. So you have this man who, he was not even 30 at this point. He just survived the war. His father died in his arms shortly before liberation, and he almost died. And he was confined to a wheelchair or bedridden for a year. It's called The Accident. But there's another book by Elie Wiesel called The Trial of God.
Trial of whom?
The Trial of God, which is in light of what we're talking about, Jewish literature that deals with catastrophes. And he says that let's look at it. I made photocopies for us. Here. Thank you. Not of the book, just of a preview to the book, so we know what it's about. Okay? You ready? One page. So it says here, the trial of God, as it was held on February 25th, 1649, in Shamogorod. And Elie Wiesel wrote in French, so at least three of us can understand. Le procès de Shamogorod tel qu'il se déroula le 25 février 1649. First published in English in 1979. It's a play by Elie Wiesel about a fictitious trial, right? Not a real trial, calling God as the defendant. So God is put on trial. Though the setting itself is fictional, and the play's notes indicates that it should be performed as a tragic farce, the events that he based this story on were witnessed firsthand as a teenager in Auschwitz. So Wiesel says that he saw the trial of God in Auschwitz. What was going on there? Historical background. In introducing the setting for the play, Wiesel gives us an idea of the provenance of the Din Torah trial concept. Its genesis, inside the kingdom of night, I witnessed a strange trial. 3 rabbis, all erudite and pious men, decided one winter evening to indict God for allowing his children to be massacred. C'est fort, huh? I remember, I was there, says Elie Wiesel, and I felt like crying, but nobody cried. All right? The trial lasted several nights. Witnesses were heard, evidence was gathered, conclusions were drawn, all of which issued finally a unanimous verdict. The Lord God Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, was found guilty of crimes against creation and humankind. And then, after what Wiesel describes as an infinity of silence, the Talmudic scholar looked at the sky and said, it's time for Arvit, it's time for Mariv, it's time for evening prayers. And the members of the tribunal recited Mariv, the evening service. The celebratory atmosphere of Purim is contrasted in the story with the historical setting in Eastern Europe in 1649, after the Chmelinsky massacres we just spoke about, right? Shortly after a series of pogroms across the area that is now modern-day Ukraine and Poland. These pogroms were associated with the Chmelinsky uprising, which devastated Jewish villages like the fictitious Shamogrod of the play. So, tell me, friends, how do you understand the late Elie Wiesel's message to us as a Jew, and as a traditional Jew as that, after the Holocaust? Wiesel and I used to pray in the same synagogue. He actually read some of my work before I published my first book and encouraged me. He was a very generous man. As you know, he encouraged a lot of new writers and thinkers to promote their work. So Wiesel has a message for us here. So he's telling us the story. So apparently he witnessed something like that when he was in the camps in his teens. God is being put on trial for crimes against humanity or crimes against the Jewish people or Jewish children. And he's found guilty by 3 great rabbis in the camp. And right after they declare God guilty, one of them said, "It's time for evening services." And they go and they pray the evening service, Mariv, Arvit. What do you
God.
Right. So what is Elie Wiesel trying to tell us here? What do you think he's trying to... Yes, sir.
To me, it's God is guilty, no question about it. And there's nothing to say about it, that we just have to resign ourselves to God's way, and we must still honor God as the supreme being and go on.
And forgive him.
Is he mocking God in some way?
I think it's saying that
Mocking people.
even if God is guilty, you still acknowledge what you're supposed to do. Life still remains the same. I don't see why they said God was guilty. If God gave man free will, why does God get money for it?
That's very good. That's exactly what we're going to read. Another text now by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, one of the greatest rabbis of our time, and we will see how he answers that question. So I want to say 2 things about that, about this incredible story by Elie Wiesel. Really an incredible story, right? So powerful, so intense, so penetrating. And so, what would happen to humanity without God is a question. Because, National Socialism, Nazism, was an atheistic regime. Stalinism too, communism or Maoism in China were atheistic regimes. Together they're responsible for the death of over 100 million people. Right? But there's so much going on here. This is what I wanted to tell you. First is, there's the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes in the Bible. King Solomon is the author. That our tradition attributes authorship to King Solomon. King Solomon basically says throughout this book, Ecclesiastes, the best book I know of about the meaning of life, he basically says this: look, there's nothing new under the sun. Everything repeats itself. I became a world statesman, a king, a head of state. It's empty. I'm going to the grave. Nobody will remember me. I've accumulated a lot of fortune and orchards. I became a real estate tycoon. Doesn't matter. I'm just going to pass away like everybody else. I knew great world delights and sensuous pleasures and women and wine, but that doesn't matter. That's also fleeting. I studied countless wisdoms. I got many PhDs at UCLA, but I'm going to perish. And at the end of the book, he says, Sof davar et Elokim yirav et hamizvot shmo ki ze kol ha'adam. In the final analysis, revere God and observe the mitzvot, for such is the entirety of man. This is what we have to show for. when we try to live with spirituality and ethics, when we try to live Jewishly, then we try to infuse our lives with dignity and purpose. And that's the best thing that we can do in the handful of decades that we have on this earth, says King Solomon. Now there is a midrash, a rabbinic story, about how did Abraham come to recognize God's presence in the world. And the midrash tells us that Abraham saw an illuminated palace. An illuminated palace or an illuminated city, depends how you translate. And one understanding is that God saw a palace or a city full of light. He saw God's infinite light permeating the world. He saw that beyond the facade of matter, there lurks God's vitality, God's energy, God's light, emanating and permeating and enlivening the world. So that's a spiritual understanding why God saw an illuminated city or an illuminated palace. The other explanation is that God actually saw a city in flames or a palace in flames. He saw a world with hungry children. He saw a world torn in wars. He saw a world of plagues and genocide and poverty. And he decided to make it his business to partner with God to alleviate these atrocities. Make sense? So,
who wanted to partner with God? Who wanted to partner with God?
Abraham. Okay. By the way, I want to share with you, I feel very honored. I was invited on Sunday to give the invocation, the rabbinic address at the main Holocaust memorial service.
The one coming up?
On Sunday with the Museum of the Holocaust and San Jose's Museum of the Holocaust. And the theme this year is rebellion. They're going to commemorate 75 years to the rebellion of the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto, which was the largest ghetto in Europe. And I think the Jews who rebelled against the Germans in the Warsaw Ghetto inflicted more fatalities on the Germans in 1943 than the entire Polish army combined. So
They had a lot of guns. How did they do that?
They smuggled some light weapons and they fought to the bone. They had nothing to lose. Now, so the theme of the memorial this year is rebellion. So what I want to suggest is that our rebellion after the Holocaust as the Jewish people is a threefold rebellion. First, it's a military rebellion, right? Now we have the state of Israel. Israel is a military nuclear superpower. Never again will we be left to the goodwill of the world or lack thereof. That's the first rebellion. It's a rebellion against Jewish political and military passivity. The second rebellion is a spiritual and intellectual rebellion and a cultural rebellion. Today there are more people studying Torah in university, in academia, in synagogues, in yeshivas than in any other time in Jewish history. More than before the Holocaust, more even than the Talmudic academies in Babylonia in Talmudic times. And thirdly, the third rebellion is a humanitarian one. We are determined, we as the Jewish people, to continue to be a blessing to the world. God told Abraham, Veheye bracha, be a blessing to the world. We continue to be a blessing to the world. As Jewish Americans, we're a great blessing to this country. Jewish people in general, through Nobel Prizes and through science and technology and medicine, and Israeli delegations after humanitarian disasters to places in the world which underwent an earthquake or what have you. The fact that 51% of the lawyers fighting for civil rights in the 60s were Jewish. So, hi Judith. So that's our threefold rebellion. Political and military, we took our fate in our own hands. Intellectually, culturally, spiritually, continuing our tradition more than ever before. And thirdly, continuing to be a blessing for the rest of humankind. Yes, please.
I read recently that when Eli Wiesel was in New York, before he was married, he went to speak to the last Rebbe Shearsman, and he told the Rebbe he never wanted to marry or have children. He wanted to bring children into the world. And it was the Rebbe that was guiding him and advised him that he should get married and have kids.
Yeah.
And that's probably true, I think.
Okay. Very nice.
It's interesting today with what's going on in Syria as far as Israel being Jews being dominating the world.
Yeah.
I look at it, there's a genocide of the people that are not in favor of Assad, and this keeps going on and on and on. I don't understand what position Israel and the United States should have.
Well, it's not so simple. It's certainly atrocities. People are being gassed, including children.
How much do you have to have of an atrocity? Does it have to be like when the United States, didn't do anything during the war when they knew what was going on?
Well, first of all, there are crimes against humanity happening in Syria in a very significant scale, including the gassing of women and children. No doubt about it. Excuse me. Genocide is when you want to wipe out an entire population.
Well,
Assad is doing that to defeat ISIS. And ISIS, which formerly controlled much of Syria, is also a genocidal party. They also perpetrated quasi-genocidal campaigns against the Yazidis and other minorities. So we basically have in Syria two murderous genocidal parties perpetrating atrocities against each other. And it's a very kind of tricky situation because it's one devil against another devil. The alternative to Assad is ISIS. You see what I'm getting at?
But what you said before in terms of genocide, when you want to wipe out a whole population.
Yeah.
How do you define a whole population?
Well, the word genocide is well, it's more than semantics because genocide is a legal term, and geno means people in Greek. So it's when you target an entire group of people, for that entire group of people to be murdered by the millions or by the hundreds of thousands, that's genocide.
But Assad wants to get rid of everyone that's not in favor of him being the head of the country.
But they're both
right.
They're both
right.
Anyway, there's ISIS, there's Assad, they're both equally terrible.
And Israel is the only country in the world who reacted by bombing.
Anyway, I agree with you. It's beyond scandalous. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying that the situation there is terrible, absolutely terrible. Why only 3? I asked for more copies. Okay, that doesn't. Okay. Oh, you took a copy. Do you have a copy of this?
I do.
Okay. Eli, do you have a copy of this, the letter? Yeah.
Eli has.
Okay, Eli, please read with Judith. Okay.
What's that?
Please read with Judith. Okay. Do you have a copy of this, letter 11?
Yes.
Okay. Mark. Okay. I actually have one more copy. Okay, ready? So now I want to give you Rabbi Jonathan Sacks's thoughts about the Holocaust. What Rabbi Sacks is going to argue is that the Holocaust is not a failure of God, it's a failure of humanity, alongside what Mickey has been saying, that God gives humanity free will. Okay? So let's see. Letter 11. These are fictitious letters that supposedly Rabbi Sacks writes for the new generation, for a fictitious person, Jewish person called Michael. You can download this entire book online. It's called Letters to the Next Generation. And then there's Letters to the Next Generation 2. And this is from Letters to the Next Generations 2. Letter 11, Faith After the Holocaust. It's, as you see, it's different things. And here's a question that Michael supposedly wrote Rabbi Sachs. But how can you really believe after the Holocaust when Jews cried out and heaven was silent? When 1.5 million innocent children were murdered merely because their grandparents were Jews? How can anyone believe in God after that? Yours, Michael. Answers Rabbi Sachs. Michael, that is the question of questions. But the truth is that I have known many Holocaust survivors. They have been my friends, my mentors. They're among the strongest and most life-affirming people I've ever met. How they survived, seeing what they saw, knowing what they know, I have no idea. Yet in all the years, not one of them ever asked me, where was God at Auschwitz? Some undoubtedly lost their faith in those years. Some kept it, and some regained it afterwards in the course of time. Some never did believe, not then, not now. But the question, where was God, was not born in the Holocaust. It was born the day Cain, the first human child, killed his brother Abel. God warned Cain beforehand, but he did not stop him. Why not? The answer, and it is a tough answer, is that God does not stop people doing what they have chosen to do. Without that, there would be no freedom. The universe would be a vast prison camp. God isn't like that. A large part of the Hebrew Bible is the story of God's disappointment at what we have done with the freedom He gave us, but He does not take it back. Now let me be candid. The Holocaust creates for me a continuous crisis of faith, which gets deeper the more I read about it. How, after Auschwitz, can any of us ever again have faith, not in God, but in humanity? The Holocaust did not take place long ago and far away. It happened less than a century ago in the heart of post-religious, enlightened, rationalist Europe. In the land, nation, and culture that produced Goethe, Schiller, Mozart, Beethoven, Kant, and Hegel. These are philosophers, musicians, playwrights we all know, that claim to have reached a new peak of human civilization. What Sachs is basically saying here is that there was a point in time in which Europe became secular, and they said we don't need God and religion. We can count on our reason and rationality alone, and we will redeem all of humanity's ills. That illusion came to a tragic end in Auschwitz. Nor was it created by uneducated masses. Listen to this. This is really fast. This is really powerful. More than half of those who sat together at Wannsee in January 1942 and planned the final solutions, the extermination of all of Europe's 11 million Jews, carried the title doctor. They were either medical doctors or had PhDs. So the Wannsee Conference, the highest Nazi officials convened to officially declare the genocide of the Jewish people as their goal. Most of them were doctors. So the notion that human education
it's a very interesting point because we always think, or at least I do, of Hitler as a madman.
Right.
You know,
makes our life too easy. Yeah.
You know what's scary too is Europe has become very secular now.
Sure. Yeah.
Very
secular. Right. The next paragraph. Heidegger, the greatest German philosopher of the 20th century, was an enthusiastic member of the Nazi Party, betrayed his Jewish colleagues and students, and never after the war expressed remorse for what he had done. Scientists, lawyers, judges, doctors, and academics all played their part in the extermination of the Jews, and almost none registered a protest. Not one of the disciplines claimed to be expressive of the new humanism acted as a barrier to inhumanity. So science proved no protection for the Jews. The racial anti-Semitism born in Germany was based on two so-called sciences.
Social Darwinism?
Yeah. Let's skip to the last paragraph. It is not easy. You see where I am? It is not easy to have faith after Auschwitz. The Klausenberger Rav, Rabbi Yekutiel Halberstam, who lived through several extermination camps, once said, "The real miracle is that we who survived the Holocaust still have faith. That, my friends, is the greatest miracle of all." Yes. Rabbi Halberstam lost his 11 children and wife in the camps. And he remarried after the war and had 4 more children. And he made an oath that if he survives, he will dedicate his life to bringing more life to the world. And he built the Laniado Hospital in Israel, which still exists. There was a documentary about him on Israeli television. So this is Rabbi Sachs's answer that really the Holocaust is what happens when humanity is left to its own devices. He says also that when people disembarked from the trains at Auschwitz, they had people play string quartets. The Germans had them play Mozart or Beethoven. Yes?
I have a way of conceptualizing this problem. Mm-hmm. You know, why people do what they do, mm-hmm. and why, even though there were doctors among the group formulating the final solution, why wasn't that education and knowledge enough to stop them or interrupt that kind of a thinking process to eliminate all the Jews? Mm-hmm. Very simply, it's a matter of two kinds of people in the world, and almost you can divide everyone into one group or another. Those that have a conscience and those that do not have a conscience. Mm-hmm. And those that do not have a conscience are the sociopaths and the psychopaths. And those who have a conscience are the people with love, empathy, with God. They're the ones, the people with a conscience know the difference between right and the definition.
Unfortunately, it's not so simple.
It isn't.
Yeah, the next question is, how do you get a conscience?
From your parents.
All right.
If your parents didn't have a conscience, you're not going to have a conscience.
No, that's not necessarily true.
No.
All right. I'm gonna.
Did your parents have a conscience?
I don't know.
Oh.
All right. I'm gonna take us back to the texts. Okay. It's an interesting question. It's a philosophical question. Mm-hmm. And I want to read to you. I'd like to read to you a poem that I translated from Hebrew that was written by Natan Alterman, who was one of the foremost Israeli poets. Okay? I don't think we have another copy of it. Let's see if I can make for us a quick photocopy here. Hold on.
No.
Oh, good. So, he don't agree with your concept.
No?
Doesn't know.
Here we go.
But they don't know.
They don't have to do it. How do you do that?
So,
Two people.
so your
No?
concept
Why did it only
is
print
just,
one?
he says it's not that easy,
Well, but
right?
you have
So
to.
you go like that.
You have
and
to devise a method of X's and
But
O's.
they don't divide it that way.
But you have to have X's and O's. It has to one way or another.
Is Sack spelled C-H or C-K?
S-A-C-K-S.
Jonathan is his first name.
Okay, we're done.
Do you know who took Jonathan Sack's place? The head of,
Yeah,
what's his name?
he was the head rabbi.
Okay.
Yeah, what's his name? What's his name? Do you know?
Jonathan Sack?
No, he's retired, but someone must have taken his place.
Oh, I don't know.
Ephraim, Mayor, something. 1, 2, 3, 4. Sorry. I made one. I should have made one more. I'm sorry. Okay. So this is from Natan Alterman, who is a leading Israeli poet, was in Israel's early days. This is 1942. Alterman is living in Israel. News of the systematic murder of European Jews is reaching Israel. And he writes in 1942, of course 6 years before Israel was established, in Haaretz, he published this poem, the daily Israeli newspaper which exists to this day. In 1942, when the first news about the Holocaust reached the Zionist Jewish community in British Mandate Palestine, Alterman wrote a poem which can be described as a sarcastic paraphrase on the Jewish prayer, Ki banu v'charta v'otanu kidashta mikol ha'amim, for you have chosen us and sanctified us from all other peoples. In this poem, Alterman says, at our children's, well, let me give you my translation of it. Look at the next paragraph. As our children weep in the shadow of gallows, the wrath of the world we hear not. For you have chosen us from all peoples. You loved us and wanted us. For you have chosen us from all peoples, from Norwegians, from Czechs, and from Brits. And as our children march towards the gallows, Jewish children, wise children, they know that their blood is not like other bloods. They only call out to their mother, do not look. So, obviously what Alterman is doing is another kind of literature which kind of inverts the Jewish notion of chosenness. What are we chosen for? For genocide, right? And their blood is not like other blood, the blood of other children. The fact that the Jewish blood had no immunity, and one could murder Jewish children with impunity, right? It's a very depressing poem, but it's also a very powerful one, don't you think?
Yeah.
It's a very powerful one. So, so that's that. Next week, God willing, we'll have a class about Israel, because next week will be Holocaust.
Israel Memorial Day.
Right, and on that night, next, it's funny because our class starts at 9:30, right, and in Israel it will already be 7:30 p.m. at night, so like an hour into our class it will already be Independence Day in Israel, because in Israel Memorial Day eases into Independence Day. So next week we will have a class about Israel. We'll say that today's, this Shabbat's parashat Shmini, has in it the death of two of Aaron's sons. Aaron, Moses' brother, who was the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, had 4 sons. Itamar, Elazar, Nadav, and Avihu. And Nadav and Avihu were killed mysteriously by a strange fire in this week's parasha. So first of all, what is very striking is Aaron's response, or lack thereof. The Torah says, Vaidom Aharon, and Aaron was silent. He didn't say anything, which is a very powerful response. We know that a lot of survivors didn't speak for many years. Yesterday, I watched on Israeli TV an interview with Anne Frank's stepsister, who is now giving talks all over the world. She's 89. She was here recently, but she only started talking recently. So a lot of people didn't speak for more than half a century. In Israel, there was like a knot with a silent K of silence, as we say in Hebrew.
Why do you think that is?
In Israel?
No, why do you think that they did not speak about it?
Sometimes, until a certain time, maybe the world didn't want to hear.
Can I tell you why my parents didn't talk about it? Because they wanted us to grow up and be raised as Americans without that over our heads. Wanted us to, they came to this country to have a family here, to live American life, and they didn't want us to be brought down by that.
Everybody had different approaches. Yeah. My grandfather, he wasn't a survivor, he was a refugee. He escaped from the Nazis, but his parents and siblings, 2 of them, were murdered. He spoke about it all the time. All the time he spoke. So different people reacted in different ways. It varied basically from person to person, from family to family.
Right.
One of the 2 watershed moments in which survivors started speaking more, one was the Eichmann trial in the early 60s in Israel. People started listening on the radio to the testimonies of the witnesses, both in Israel and America, and then people started talking about it more. At the beginning, a lot of survivors felt ashamed, especially in Israel. The Israelis were the native Israelis were like, you have to be tough, you have to fight. They felt judged, And secondly, believe it or not, after Schindler's List almost 30 years ago came out, a quarter of a century ago came out, the world became, through that Hollywood feature, more interested and more aware of the Holocaust. So
your direct response probably would be, when is humanity ready to listen to this calamity?
Right.
It's interesting, when you said people stopped talking, I thought you meant initially they were so traumatized they didn't talk for years. I didn't realize you meant
that too.
To talk about.
Well, that too. A lot of people were traumatized and they didn't want to talk for many years. We have our members, Ron and Paulette Nissim. Paulette's mother is 95, should be well to 120. She appears in 2 documentaries. One is called After Auschwitz, which is now on screen at the Lamleys. Another one you can watch on Amazon Prime called Swimming in Auschwitz. She's there with 6-7 other survivors, and she doesn't go and talk about the Holocaust. If she wouldn't come if I were to invite her to speak to my high school class. Just because she spoke in these 2 documentaries doesn't mean. So it's still hard for a lot of people to speak. But I want to connect it to this week's Torah. We see Aaron losing 2 of his 4 children, but continuing his mission to be a Kohen, to be a source of good and sanctity in the world. And he continues his mission even after that. And there are 3 ways to understand what caused the death of 2 of Aaron's sons by what the Torah calls enigmatically a strange fire, a foreign fire. One way to understand it, Rashi says that they entered the Holy of Holies in a state of intoxication. In other words, today you can call it drug abuse. People think that they can find sustained joy and vitality through drugs and intoxication. That will only lead people towards bad things and in extreme cases even death.
So that implies they never intended to go there.
To where?
In the Holy of Holies.
No, they did, but they entered it in a state of intoxication.
Okay, so
that's
different than if they weren't intoxicated.
Correct, absolutely. That's exactly the point. Secondly, another interpretation is that they said we can't wait for Dad, meaning Aaron, and Uncle Moses to retire, so we'll take over their job, right? Just like today, you have people who are saying, "Oh, we can't wait for our father to retire. We can take over the family company," that kind of thing. In other words, they didn't know their place, right? Thirdly, and this is my small idea, is that as today we see in our world people who are committing unspeakable atrocities in God's name, right? Let's say like ISIS, for example, or Iran, right? In the name of religion, people are committing atrocities. Rabbi Sachs wrote a book about it called Not in God's Name, Confronting Religious Violence in Today's World. Excellent book. And he talks about those who wage war in the name of the God of peace, those who practice cruelty in the name of the God of compassion, and those who preach death in the name of the God of life. And it's incumbent upon us, people of faith, to use Mark's words with a conscience, to fight fire with fire, the fire of zealotry with the fire of an enlightened humanistic religiosity. And when God sees people perpetrating atrocities in His name, God is estranged from such demonic religious fire. That is a strange fire in God's eyes.
I thought the other interpretation was that the sons wanted to be with God, and they thought by dying their souls would be with God. I don't know where I read. I've always assumed that was the one that people thought about.
Well, that could be indeed a very deep interpretation. You know, in some spiritual faiths or doctrines, people say if you want to really connect to God, then you need to divorce yourself from the world and have no family and live somewhere remote in complete isolation and not enjoy life's pleasures like good food and wine. But that's not the Jewish view. The Jewish view is that you spiritualize yourself in this world by drinking wine and eating food on Shabbat, by being part of a family, by being part of the community, by having children. So our idea is that in order to celebrate God, sanctify God, spiritualize ourselves in the world, we engage in the world and we celebrate life, rather than denigrate life and the human body and so forth. Yes, sir.
Okay, this is what the Torah says about that incident. Number 10, chapter 10. Now Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, each took his fire pan, put fire in it, and laid incense on it, and they offered before the Lord alien fire.
Yes.
With the incense,
right,
apparently,
yeah,
is the alien fire. So, but is that something that when they had these fire pans, did people not supposed to put incense on it, or?
But didn't they get
you're reading it on a very technical, simple level.
Yeah.
But
I'm reading what the book says.
Yeah, but we don't. The way we Jews do Torah is not by reading only what the book says, but we read
reading between the lines and the words.
Both between the lines and the words, and through the mediation of the rabbinic commentaries from antiquity to today. And Rashi, for example, says that they entered the state of the Holy of Holies intoxicated, because the previous parasha talks about not being intoxicated in the sanctuary. But the very notion of esh zara, strange fire, alien fire, foreign fire, is not a physical term. There's no such thing as an alien fire, right? If I'm going to start a fire here, you're going to say, this is an alien fire. It doesn't have a green card. It doesn't have an American passport. An alien fire is not a physical term, right? It's a spiritual term. Correct? We agree? Okay, good.
One other thing, if I can follow up on that.
Yeah.
Because these are these interpretations, and it says here, this is a law for all time throughout the ages. Mm-hmm. And the commentary people decide, we're going to ignore that. It says it in the Torah, this is forever.
What is forever? Keep reading.
This one's just drink no wine or other intoxicant before you're,
mm-hmm.
This is the law for all time.
Right. So you should be sober when you stand before God. And actually, it is still a law. Nobody ignores it. Okay. For example, I remember when you shouldn't pray if you had quite a bit to drink, if you're a little tipsy even. Just like if you had 2.5 glasses, you shouldn't drive, you also shouldn't pray. I remember a good friend of mine in rabbinical school, we once talked about praying the evening prayer, Mariv, Arvit. And he asked me, do you pray Arvit? I say, yeah, I try to as much as I can in the evening. And he said, I many times don't, because if I have a couple of beers, then I prefer not to. So actually there's a halacha based on this, a Jewish ruling, that you should stand before God in joy, in jubilation, with intensity, but also with sobriety. So actually there is a very important halacha based on this.
And there's another one that has to do with, in the sacrifice, that the Levites would get the breast and the thigh, mm-hmm. and it says the same thing. This is a law for all time.
Right.
But mm-hmm. they decided to ignore that law.
It's not that we ignore it. That there is no temple today. That's all.
But this is the tabernacle.
Okay, but there is no.
The tabernacle is not a temple. This was all.
Yeah, but the laws of the tabernacle ultimately served as the laws for the temples. The tabernacle was temporary, just for the few decades in the desert. Ultimately, these laws were applied to temple times, and there they were in effect for centuries. Okay? All right.